thanks for coming. I think I met everyone here, but I'm Helen Peterson, Sustainability Manager at Livable Buckhead. And our mission is to make Livable Buckhead a place where everyone can live, work, and play sustainably. And the more and more we've learned about embodied carbon, we have really felt like we need to continue to learn more and implement some policies so we can really walk the walk instead of just talk the talk. And with that, we've been working with the Urban Land Institute and sponsored 2 mTAPs now. Last year, we had a cohort put together an embodied carbon action plan that laid out kind of a timeline and action items that we need to do. And one of them was to take a next step and really come up with a baseline and look at what embodied carbon looks like in our buildings in the Buckhead neighborhood. And we've decided to focus on multifamily housing since that's what we foresee a lot of new development to be in the future. So this group has been working with us for the past 6 months and put together a great presentation for us. And we want to keep it conversational, so feel free to ask questions as they come up.
Okay. Let's do introductions.
Okay.
Everybody.
Yeah, sure.
I'm Jen Starley, Executive Director of Livable Buckhead.
I'm Eric Bailiff. I'm the Associate Principal with that.
Hi, I'm Ricky Gupta. I'm a Senior Futures Practice Leader at HBS.
And Derek Dolezal, Streetlights Residential Development.
Patrick Ford, planner at Livable.
Les White with Cemex.
Amy Williams, President and Chair of Sustainability with Shauna Aki, Managing Director at TDS and part of the mTAP team last year reading and development action.
We couldn't have done what we did without you. What you did.
And I'm Amy Brunelli with Emily and Associates, and this year I was the mTAP chair. So thanks to Livable Buckhead for submitting this other end.
Awesome. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming this morning. As you know, we're the mTAP group for 2024. We're working with Livable Buckhead. We'll just introduce ourselves and kind of talk about what we're going to be talking about today. And then everyone kind of has their section, so we'll go through everything. Again, like raise your hand at any time to ask questions. This doesn't need to be like super formal or anything, but we will have like Q&A after every section, just so we can kind of have a conversation. My name is Claire Hansen. I'm a Director of Development at Rainwater Real Estate. So we build residential all over the country. We have offices all the way to Dallas, to Denver, and then in Florida. So we do build to rent, we do mid-rise residential, we do garden deals, we do active adult. So we're kind of all over the place. We don't do high rise. So I learned a lot about this because high rise, was part of our study. So pass it to my group members.
Right.
Introduce yourself.
Ramana Koti, Sustainable Design Leader in the Atlanta metropolitan area. I'm standing my own consulting firm up. More details.
My name is Kenneth Bigway. I'm a commercial lender. We lend for commercial real estate assets, debt as well as equity, bridge loans as well as permanent, all 4 verticals, office, retail, multifamily, as well as industrial.
And I'm Charles Acom. I am a civil engineer with Kendall Horn, and I focus mostly on in-town urban redevelopment projects, but I do anything. I'm an omnivore.
So I wanted to set the stage of like everything we're going to be talking about today. We'll go through kind of the vision statement, what Livable Buckhead really wanted out of this project, and then we will move to actually kind of like a survey of the entire industry around embodied carbon, what it means, what are some of the industry trends right now. Then we'll actually go into the case study we did of a Proxy building in Buckhead, measuring its embodied carbon and a threshold on how much we think that we could reduce based off of industry trends. And then lastly, we talk about ways that Livable Buckhead can work with developers to have alternative design techniques and materials to reduce embodied carbon in high-rise residential. So I'll pass it over to Ray.
Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to chat about the survey of the industry, just kind of give you guys an update as to an overview of what we chatted about as well. So lifecycle carbon emission, very simple. It's essentially the total carbon footprint of a building for its entire life cycle. It includes raw material extraction, production of materials, the construction of materials, plus demolition as well as recycling of materials. In this raw material two types of embodied carbon, or two types of LCC. We've got embodied carbon as well as operational carbon. Embodied carbon essentially states that the raw materials, construction, and production, things of that sort. In addition to the operational carbon, speaks to the operations of the building, the emissions that are generated in the operation of the building. Now we're going to chat about the factors of LCC, things such as material selection. When you're designing or putting together the LCC, the things that really influence it are materials, which ones you're going to use, such as concrete as well as steel. Today we're going to go into a little bit more depth about those two particular products, in addition to construction processes. These are high embodied carbon processes. Developing cement, developing concrete, actually goes into that as well. Energy use, the operations of the building, that also affects embodied carbon and also affects the life cycle carbon emissions as well. And then maintenance and renovation. Just the regularity of maintenance, the cadence of how often we're going to do it, and also the maintenance of the building. So we want to make sure that people really understand exactly what that means for the factors of the LCC. Here we have the life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment, LCA, as we all know, is essentially the systematic approach to how we evaluate the carbon footprint of a particular building in its life cycle. So we're going to start off with a couple of stages. Here we have the product, construction stage, maintenance and use, end of life, and beyond the life cycle. So essentially it states that when we start from the extraction of the raw materials, from the production of it to the transportation, construction, and then we have maintenance and use, which includes embodied as well as operational carbon, and then of course embodied life. With embodied carbon, there's within and outside LCAs, within LCAs, and then of course outside LCAs, within LCA, which we talk about raw materials and units and processes and things of that sort, in addition to the outside LCA. Outside LCAs are essentially things that we don't necessarily include in that particular evaluation, such as human labor, such as infrastructure. So we want to make certain that we're putting together an LCA that we're considering those items as well. EPDs, Environmental Production Declaration. That's essentially third-party reports that are created by individuals who we're going to use to kind of scale that as well, and be able to kind of make sure that people really understand and get into it. So you've got a couple of stages of LCA. When you're conducting the LCA, you've got the goal and the scope and definition. Here we want to try to establish some baselines. We want to establish objectives and goals. We want to make certain that there's baselines that we can set together. As far as then we create the lifecycle inventory. Lifecycle inventory, essentially we're going to use our inputs and outputs of that material for the entire life of the process, the entire life of the building. From there, we want to make certain that we understand that, and then we go into the lifecycle impact assessment. So we're going to take the inputs as well as the outputs of that material, and we're going to put those together to try to put well. And then of course, interpretation. We're going to take our inputs and outputs, and we're going to try to assess how does this best benefit, or how can we improve upon the construction of this particular building, and also just the environmental effects of the building. Also, the design phase, the LCA can be actually used for multiple stages. You can design it. It can be in the design phase. Here we can work with architects, engineers prior to the build phase. Of course, as design phase, and of course the as build phase. So it can be applied to multiple phases, as we can see. And of course, the important software tools that we're going to discuss as well. One-click LCA that are used to kind of allow to get this LCA. One-click LCA, Tally, Athena, and Packet as well as Sumo. So these are some of the more popular software that are used to kind of obtain the LCA. And performance targets. So here we've got some aggressive performance targets and of course some less aggressive performance targets. 40% reduction starting in 2025, very aggressive with the expectation of trying to reach zero or near carbon buildings by 2040. A less aggressive target, essentially we're going to chat about 10 to 20% reduction by 2030. Many folks probably get that by 2040, 2050. Obviously these are expectations, these are goals that we've set by certain standards and bodies and kind of ways to know, ways to kind of achieve that target is to be able to, like material selection, when you're considering how to reduce the carbon footprints, you're going to look at certain things like concrete and steel. There's got to be other things that you can use to kind of provide that. Design optimization, here's where you can kind of engage with architects and try to figure out ways in which they can improve how they can use maybe fewer materials, construction techniques. This is another way in which you can design, try to reduce those ways to achieve that target. And of course, obviously, try to consider weighing options of reusing existing building materials or components. And of course, lastly, just kind of using lower carbon replacements that place for materials for renovations. So that said, just wanted to, any questions regarding this as well? Awesome. So I'm going to pass it on to Bob for a test one.
I have a question for you guys. Does everybody understand what an environmental product declaration is? That's familiar. No need to talk about that again. Okay. Ken mentioned as designed LCA and as built LCA. Does anybody want to take a guess at what might be different between the two?
What was drawn versus what the contractor did.
Yeah. So the quantity of materials, right? When you take volumes off of a BIM model, you're getting a pretty straightforward number. But when contractors order materials, they might account for waste on site. So the amount of material might differ. And what the simulation software do for construction-related emissions, for the equipment, for the fossil fuels burned on site, electricity used on site for the construction process itself, they have some placeholders. They don't know exactly what your contractor is going to do. So instead of 0, they have per square foot default assumption. But when you do an as-built LCA, you get all that information from the contractor. How much of what material and how much electricity did you burn, how much diesel, and you input all that back into the software, so your numbers are more accurate at this point. Does that make sense? Any questions before we move on to the next? Okay. All right, so we have to have a starting point, and it's a wild west out there in terms of building types and how each multifamily apartment looks. So we use the Hanover Village project as a reference building. And as you can tell, there's a lot of concrete in the structure and the parking, and mostly glass in the enclosure. There's not much opaque wall with insulation. And as Ken alluded to, there's a lot of stages and boundaries when it comes to life cycle assessment. And if you're not clear about where you're drawing the line, things can get pretty confusing. And regardless of where you draw the line, the amount of data available that's really useful is still very low out there. So at least it helps to have clear, stages and boundaries. So what we're looking at in this study is structure and enclosure only. We have some general recommendations for interiors, but that's what we're limiting the study to. And stages A1 through A3. We're not looking at the one before that, or transportation of materials or emissions on site during construction. So as long as we're clear on that. Any questions about this?
So I'm assuming that was driven because those are the biggest contributors to embodied carbon, that you focused in on structure and enclosure, or how did you all decide that was the most important?
Oh, for structure and enclosure, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, you'll get an answer for that.
But yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's why they have the biggest impact if you reduce them.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything else? A1 through A3 for the same reason, because the data available out there is mostly for that. I mean, even in EBDs and all that, that's what is available out there. Okay, so now a baseline, right? We have to have a starting point, and it wouldn't be hyperbole to say the information available out there is not just good enough, right? Carbon Leadership Forum maintains a database, so every time you do an LCA, you report numbers voluntarily to the Carbon Leadership Forum, and they collect all that information and say, okay, throughout the buildings available in the US, this is what a good baseline number in terms of kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square meter. That's the unit we're using. And you can also call it embodied carbon intensity. So for all, so on the x-axis of the chart is the number of floors in the multifamily building, and the y-axis is the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square meter. So for 15 to 25 stories multifamily building, the baseline falls at 373, right? And based on my own project experience, I'm finding that if you build it to today's standards, business as usual, you don't try to reduce anything, you will end up about 10% better than that benchmark. So that gives you a baseline of 336. Now again, based on information out there, literature, and my own project experience, it's safe to assume that 70% is structure, 20% is enclosure, and 10% is interiors. So that's our starting point in terms of looking at reduction strategies. Does that make sense?
Why is there so much variation between the 7 to 14? Because that is a huge spread compared to the other building heights.
Yeah, so if you look at the legend, I'm sure it's not visible properly, but some are structure only, some are structure enclosure interior, some are structure foundation. So the color of the dot, I don't have the legend here, I'm sorry. But yeah, again, the scope of the number is different.
Is that related to the type of structure?
Yeah, it's the type of construction. So that at that kind of threshold, 7 to 14 levels in a building is where you're determining whether like a big difference in concrete or steel fluctuates a lot in that particular group of buildings. Whereas a high rise, you know, it's for the most part, you know how much steel and concrete you're going to use every floor.
This data from Carbon Leadership Forum, is it all over the US?
Yeah, it's not region specific.
And was there a number that they had in terms of how many data sets they had? Or?
I'll have to get back to you on that. I think each dot is a project on the chart. We're good? All right. So now, Denise and Helen tried a lot to find an actual BIM model, actual specifications that we can put through the simulation software and get information. In the lack of all that, we had to make assumptions on what is potentially possible and how much it would reduce things, and stick to that 70% structure, 20% enclosure, 10% interiors breakdown. And there is a case study in the National Ready Mix Concrete Association's website of a high-performing multifamily project that took all the different types of concrete used in different locations of the building and the rebars and everything. They went all the way and reduced the embodied carbon by 24% of the concrete structure itself. So we said, okay, if 24% is the best case scenario, then maybe 12, 18, and 24 for good, better, best is a good assumption. And that corresponds with the projects we're seeing in terms of analysis and whatnot. So again, windows. So majority of the enclosure of the project is windows, right? And we found one European, data hard to come by, European paper, they looked at 116 EPDs or something of different frame materials, different double glazing, triple glazing. They found that on average, the embodied carbon reduction for aluminum frame, double glazing windows was 28%. And so we said, okay, if 28% is the best high performing level, then 14 is good, 21 is better, and 28 is the best. So that's how we came up with those numbers pertaining to structure and windows. Does that make sense? So the next thing was to take the baseline and apply those reduction percentages to the weighting of. So the concrete numbers would apply to 70% of your baseline. the window numbers would apply to 20% of your baseline. And because there's no interiors, there's no line item for interiors here. But when you take that weighting into account, you get a good, better, best of overall performance of 11, 17, and 22. So if you try not too hard, you can hit 11% with relative ease, little more effort, 17%, and best case 22%. And that again corresponds with what we're seeing on projects. Does this make sense? The blue in the chart is concrete, orange is enclosure, and the gray is interior.
And that's during construction?
Say that again?
And that's during construction?
Due to construction?
The percentages, it's materials?
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
construction?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are the same percentages after construction for the lifespan of the building for residents when it comes to energy consumption and carbon?
So we're only looking at A1 through A3, which is cradle to gate. The materials get manufactured and come to the site. That's all we're looking at. Yeah, extracted. Yeah.
So it's like holding all else equal.
Correct.
You, at the best case scenario, you could get 22% reduced embodied carbon by using some alternative design, alternative materials. That's like best case scenario based off of kind of the research that we did. So if you do 22% reduction and you deliver your building, and then the tenants within that building are incredibly huge, like use insane amount of energy use, like that probably is going to erode some of the overall life cycle, like embodied carbon reduction of the building.
That's a good point there, because initially the focus was on operational energy, right? But you're doing net zero operational energy, and now your embodied carbon has become a huge piece of the pie. So, does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right.
I was just looking if the design and the material is talking just not for the construction,
Right.
but also there will be some benefit that on the long term that the residents will pick. I want that constructor because they followed for the lifespan. So there is a benefit, not just from the construction side,
Yeah.
but for residents to pick which contractor.
Yeah. Yeah. Denise and Helen, there's your another idea for the next year. Thank you. Okay, so now we went to the lead language and said, what is lead saying? How does it compare to what we're doing? And lead says, at least on version 5, is changing a lot of things. LCA will be a prerequisite if the comments period, if the current language holds true. But if you conduct an LCA, you get 1 point. And this is very simplified, the language is too complex. But if you get 5% reduction, you get 2 points, 10% reduction, 3 points, and 20% reduction, 4 points. So, roughly aligning with that. And so, my personal takeaway from all of this is, if you can do only one thing, do the structure and the concrete. And this report, which had the best performing case study that we drew on for the numbers, they have these list of things that they want you to do. I'm not going to read all of them, but you set goals, you communicate the goals to everybody, and you go do your research, and it just, like we were talking about, you just have to tell, sorry, Claire, I think Claire is an owner rep here, so if the owner comes and says, do what you need to, I need 20% reduction of embodied carbon, people get it done. So, and that's what they're saying, you can do everything, but if you don't do these things, you may not be able to hit your target. That's the end of my section. I can field any questions you may have.
And all the research Ramona did, and all the charts and their explanation, we actually have a report that we're sending to you, Denise, so you can distro it out to whoever, so it has all the research organized.
Okay, so we talked about this the other day. I know other parts of Atlanta, you mentioned structure, right?
Yeah.
Deal with the structure, and you're getting really far along to reducing the embodied carbon. Other parts of Atlanta are looking at reusing existing buildings.
Yes.
Right? Even just the whole conversation about office to residential or office to something else, but again, for different reasons, I think parts of Atlanta are looking at doing that to revitalize the downtown or whatever. But I mentioned this to you. We talk about it from, say, an affordable housing standpoint, but there's also a really big benefit for reusing existing buildings from an environmental standpoint. I mean, you just said it, right? Reuse the structure. So has Buckhead or Livable Buckhead considered doing a similar study that downtown did for what office buildings or other types of buildings you have that may be converted? And I know with that, there's often a financial gap, but there are federal and other incentives that can help, especially from an environmental standpoint, help bridge that gap. So I'm curious if you guys talked about that or if Buckhead has looked into that.
So our assumption is always that's the best case. So we were looking at sort of what was, if new development was coming, that originally, as you know, we were looking at office and we're like, oh, whoa, that's not going to happen. So that's why we switched more towards residential, because there's still a lot of demand and demand will continue to come for that. So that's what we're focused on now. Of course, reuse is going to be the best thing you can do. So that's sort of a baseline assumption, sort of in its bucket over here. So we were focused on where we could make the big impacts on new construction with this work. We also talked about that, you know, the renovations, like a lot of the structure is going to just stay the same. So you can't really do a whole lot to reduce the embodied carbon of a building that's already there. So that's where we were like, this is the direction we need to go, because it's where the new stuff is coming from that's going to actually have the impact. The impact is already there on an existing building. So we would clearly, you know, encourage adaptive reuse of the existing structure first, and then this would be more of if you're going new. If you're not doing that, this is what the things you need to look at.
I do have a question about life cycle analysis when it comes to reuse of buildings.
Yeah.
Do you think, philosophically, do you take like anything that's already built is already in the environment and we don't count that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or versus like, oh, we have to calculate what was done in the 60s or 50s when the thing was originally built?
That's really hard to do. So what you, for comparison's sake, you can compare it to a building. If it was built anew today, that could be a reference point, and not take anything into account for the existing things in place. Yeah.
One question. Do you kind of determine the percentage improvement if you were to swap the construction type to mass timber for multifamily?
That needs an LCA.
Yeah.
Yeah. A full-blown LCA, for sure.
And when, you know, in the section, the next section kind of talks about very specific design and material selection that you can do to kind of hit the best case or good case or better case. When it comes to mass timber, like it is, I try to focus on things that are very easy for developers to do. Whether you incentivize them or whether they're willing to just do it because it's now a new policy. Because they don't cost as much and like availability is there. Mass timber is right now, it's not cheaper, and it's also, if it were to start getting used more, it actually, the reduction of embodied carbon is eroded. Because if everyone's doing mass timber, then like all of the benefits of it kind of go away. Which I thought was really interesting. It's one of the articles that's kind of in the report we're sending out. I wasn't expecting that. I thought when I started, you know, researching the materials, that was going to be the first thing that was going to be like, let's just do this everywhere. And I found that really fascinating. It was almost counterintuitive a little bit.
That's funny you say that, because after that visit we had, and I was talking to my daughter, and I was like, yeah, I went for this building site tour. It was mass timber, and she's like, wait, they're going to make buildings out of mass timber? Isn't that cutting down forests? Like, how is that good for the environment?
Yeah, the sourcing part is a big question in mass timber. Always.
If everyone started doing it, it'd be like worse for the environment. It was really interesting. Unless there's a structural, systematic way.
Balance, and what is the most optimum building typology that you would use mass timber, like for example, a 2 to 3 story building, not tall.
Yeah, I think use comes into that too, because during the tour, we also talked about the complexities of using mass timber for residential, just with thinking about program elements. So I think that if this is it's focused more on residential, it's not, it doesn't really lend itself currently towards that type.
Well, and I actually had a question back when you were looking at the chart and the number of floors. It seemed like when you're talking about multifamily, you weren't thinking, I was thinking like family, where it's maybe a 3-story, but it looks like that one, it's like it starts at 7 stories.
We
Is
were
that
thinking
right?
specifically what we're gonna see in Buckhead, and the land values are driving that towards the higher
Okay,
end.
higher, okay.
It's probably hard to read, but it's like, that's your,
Yeah,
blanking on the, plain timber.
right, yeah.
1 to 6 stories.
Okay.
So like that's your 5+1.
Yeah, I was
Normal
thinking
stick
of
built
over,
is what I'm thinking
over
of.
Roxborough,
Yeah.
those apartments over there, that's what I had in my mind. And then I was like, wow, these are going to be more like the condos up here,
Mhm.
or, the larger, so.
Yeah, this presentation was for Livable Gwinnett. It would have been 1 to 5 story. That we wanted to measure what they care about most for the future.
And just to quickly circle back to the mass timber discussion, even mass timber buildings will have concrete foundation and some support steel structure here and there, so it's still important.
Okay, so my section really in the presentation was to research and to recommend very, very specific things Livable Buckhead can discuss with developers, multifamily high-rise developers, on reducing their embodied carbon. So I took basically all of Romana's research and then tried to not only understand what are the best, biggest bang for your buck design and material selection that they can do, but also how much does it cost and is it available. So I got rid of anything that was 25% over the baseline of what a developer would do, because why talk about that? It's just not going to happen. I tried to focus on kind of parameters of anything cheaper. That's awesome. Obviously, I'm going to talk about that. Anything about the same price. And I tried not to go above 10% premium to a baseline material. So that was kind of my criteria putting this together. And so what I did, I actually went a little bit beyond what Romana studied. He kind of focused on concrete and windows. I've included those, but I've also added steel, insulation, and curtain walls, which are also structural and enclosure scopes that every building tends to have. So this is not just concrete and windows. There's a little bit more options basically for Livable Buckhead to have a conversation. So the first one, and I know there's a concrete expert in the room, so just know that I am not a concrete expert. So if you have some really good insight, I'd love to hear it. But I'm going to start with steel. So steel is one of the biggest contributing factors to a building's embodied carbon and global warming emissions in general in the world. So that was a big one, obviously, we wanted to talk about. And through all kind of my research, there was really 2 things that kept on coming up every time I read about steel and reducing its embodied carbon. The first is encouraging developers and general contractors to use recycled North American steel. That's actually pretty common already. It's not that people are I want Chinese steel or I want steel from Canada. We tend to use that anyways. So it's really just encouraging them, that's our standard. If you can get recycled North American steel, that's going to have the least amount of just overall embodied carbon because we're recycling it. And it's pretty market standard. The issue is the availability. So in times where it's 2020, 2021, and everyone's building, they tend to kind of run out of the recycled steel and they have to pivot and actually create new material. So in a market availability issue, a little bit is there, but overall, using recycled North American steel is not only already kind of standard, but it's not a price premium at all. The other thing is just efficient steel design. This is a huge one. I work with architects and structural engineers all the time, and one of the things I regret every single time we go through the design phase is I don't get the structural engineer on board early enough. Usually what happens is you bring on your architect, or developer will bring on their architect, they will plan out the building footprints, they'll decide how many stories it is, they get through a schematic design phase, and then they bring in their structural engineer to kind of make sure that the building is going to hold the way that the architect designed it. If you get the structural engineer on board way earlier, it means that they're not trying to fit square peg into a round hole. They can create the hole together with the architect. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's just a process thing. And, you know, the way to kind of have that conversation with the developer is, hey, you might be spending $25K a little quicker on structural design. That $25K is gonna have dividends because you might save $500,000 on steel on the back end. So I actually had a recent project in Dorville where we had that exact same problem happen. The structural engineer came on too late, and we ended up spending $750,000 extra on steel, where if they would have just worked together from the beginning, they would have designed something a lot more efficient. Any questions on that?
From on the recycled steel component, so we're doing steel right now on our trail project, and we've had to follow a very specific fabrication process. Are you still able to do that kind of process with recycled material?
Oh, that's a great question that I don't know the answer to.
I'm sitting here regretting that I didn't know this for our steel.
I'm sure there is a way. I can't imagine that has not been figured out. Like, yeah, when it comes to prefab, you never really know like what your constraints are in using recycled materials, whether it's steel or something else. But yeah, maybe I'll look that up after this and see what I find.
I don't know if I want to know actually.
Yeah, now that you can't fix it, yeah.
Do you consider construction efficiencies in that? Because you can do an efficient design and have the appropriate size members, but if Mr. Contractor can buy 50 of one size, maybe it's oversized and using more material, but it's just flat out uniform.
Yeah, totally.
How do we push that? Because it does.
Yeah.
You have to make different shapes.
That's a good point. I think it, oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say, I think that's why Livable Buckhead, you gotta talk to developers and owners, but you also have to include the GCs in those conversations.
And have a tracking spreadsheet that they periodically report using. Which material, how much quantity, and are there EPDs related to that or not?
Well, I would actually go back to the clients here, because I think, like, I was even thinking about, as you were talking about, oh, we'll pull on the structural engineer earlier. RFPs go out and they're usually competitive, right? So making sure that that's spelled out in the developer RFPs, that way you're getting that from every architect that you get a proposal from, and then also same with like what specs are you're wanting the architects or even the GCs to bid with, right? A lot of this isn't completely transparent, especially as you're selecting what you're buying, right? So just making sure that it's really spelled out. Your expectations from an owner standpoint, I think, will get you a little bit further. And I think the architects and the GCs, they don't know what's expected.
Well, that's a great point. It's also in alignment with part of what I was thinking. It's like, wow, we haven't even seen them yet. You know, all this stuff needs to happen probably 2 years before we're even in the conversation on the development.
And what we're seeing is performance-based specs. So you tell them 20% reduction, you go figure out how. And now they're doing all the research, collecting all the EPDs, so there's definitely, if they're not used to doing it, there's definitely extra effort on their part.
And we've talked about that, Helen and Denise. Like, I think our recommendation is not go, you know, in an RFP, be very specific on what material they need to use. Well, I think it's give them a menu of options, and then they decide what works best for their project. And you're gonna get a lot more interest with developers and GCs if you do it that way versus like dictating exactly what they need to do. A menu of options just kind of gives them a lot more flexibility. Because this could change. In 2 years, that 0% price premium could be 25%. You know what I mean? So like, you want to make this kind of something that can go beyond a year, then I think menu of options is the best.
Well, I think if we're able to successfully make this as a legislation for tax breaks, then you're involved into the conversation 2 years prior.
Concrete. So very similar to steel, kind of have two recommendations for this. So instead of using like 100% pure like concrete mix, obviously using supplementary cement materials can help, whether it's fly ash or something else. The good news is that's pretty market standard. So just kind of encouraging people to use supplementary materials while they're deciding whether it's foundation or podium or whatever, is a good way to kind of just see that reduction have a very easy impact. And then very similar to steel, just an efficient concrete design. Making sure that the structural engineer is not over-engineering the concrete design within their building. It's a huge, honestly, it's the easy button. Is usually just over designing something, and so concrete is very similar to steel in that that's kind of the easiest way to reduce that. And 0% price premium if you have an efficient design. It actually usually saves you money. So.
Quick question on that. I've heard that there are challenges with using supplements to cement with cure times and
Yes.
things like that that are cost drivers in the project.
Yeah.
What's the reality of that? I'm curious since we have the concrete guy.
Sort of, kind of, maybe so.
That's a really good definitive answer.
There is truth in that. Fly ash, for example, you will get a slightly slower strength gain. Is that bad? Not always. And that's just because of the way fly ash works. You get cement water reacts and it sets up fairly quickly. And then fly ash actually reacts with one of the byproducts of that. So you have to wait until that byproduct is formed. And then as it gains strength, generally speaking, it's a little bit stronger. But that depends on what your element is. Can you afford to wait 56 days for an element to set? In some cases, absolutely. In some cases, not a chance. And so when you look at an overall project, that's the balance that you do. Do I have to have this quickly on my walls? Yes. Can I afford to do it a little more slowly in other elements? Absolutely. So you can have that conversation, and I think even in there, there was a 15-20%, whatever, ash mix. Generally, you can get your strength gain fairly quickly with something that low. Admixtures was also mentioned, which will help with that strength gain. But yes, the answer is a qualified both. But there are ways and reasons to do that. And I think also in that top 10 list is somebody said don't limit materials. You said performance. Don't be afraid of some of the materials. Let us help you, and even to the point of getting a structural engineer early, call us. The earlier the better. We can help you move in that direction so you have options, rather than getting too far down the line and you're left with what's there.
Are some of those materials, whether it's concrete or any others, or different materials, or regional, as in like Florida is going to be different than Atlanta, different than Texas?
Yes.
Yes.
New SCF silicon product from chip actually.
What was that question? Sorry.
Silica fume's not used all that much. Slag is also limited because it's byproduct of iron processing.
What about glass pozzolan?
What was that?
Glass pozzolan?
Ground glass is a pozzolanic material. Sourcing is the biggest problem. Is it clean? Green glass and clear glass behave differently, but is it clean and can you get a consistent source? But it does work very similar to the same way fly ash does.
So the next kind of scope area is insulation. So blown-in insulation is probably like one of the worst environmentally non-friendly materials in the world. And so one thing that has really been starting to get used is supplementing it with mineral wool, which is a more natural product. And it actually is cheaper than just full-in blown-in insulation. Granted, that's from, I interviewed 2 general contractors for all of this price data, so that's based off of their current pulse on the market. Again, all that can change, in 6 months, but I thought that was a really kind of easy button thing to recommend. Windows. So Romana talked about windows quite a bit. The window world, this was probably the hardest thing to kind of get good data on. Overall though, like reducing the use of aluminum double glazed windows seemed to be the most kind of industry standard suggestion or recommendation. Now, usually that research was saying just use wood windows. We can't really do that on most high-rise buildings, so that wasn't like the most helpful thing, but I think in some of the research in our report that there's quite a few like different alternatives to the aluminum, but for high-rise specifically, it was really difficult to kind of find a silver bullet suggestion on that one. But one thing that I found really interesting from the 2 general contractors I talked to is, windows are already a huge expense, especially in high-rise, and so most of the things that we discussed, they said, if you're going to go out of the box, assume a price increase. So that was the one where they were like, it's really hard to kind of peg the window prices right now, but we think overall you should assume 5 to 10% price premium.
Are all of these windows presumed to be operable?
Like open?
Yeah, operable windows. Because you have curtain walls listed, that's also glass, right?
That's also what?
That's also glass too, right?
No, curtain walls are usually made out of aluminum.
Okay.
For the ones that I'm talking about reducing are made out of aluminum. But I didn't really get into the weeds on like the actual operation of the windows. It was just like the window itself.
Yeah, envelope of the building, right? Is that what you mean, like glass, envelope of the building?
Yes.
Outside, okay.
When you say windows, is that like storefront? And then
Yeah.
there's a middle section that's window wall.
Casement.
And then there's curtain wall, which is true structurally
Yeah.
sufficient glazing system.
Yep. And then lastly, the curtain wall, I thought this was really interesting. This actually came from a general contractor who's doing this on a building they're building for Georgia Tech in West Midtown. They're doing a lot of embodied carbon reduction in that building. So this one was one that I had actually not seen in any of the research. Maybe it's just more of it's a new technique, but they are reducing the depth of the aluminum curtain wall from like 7 inches to 4 inches and then supplementing it with the glue emollients. So not only does that reduce the amount of aluminum that you're using, but it also the emollients actually provide some structural strength as well, which means that you can also tend to reduce your steel and concrete in the building. So I thought that was a really interesting one, and it's cheaper. So that was probably my favorite.
Can you explain that a little bit? So you're saying they have glue lam on the interior of the curtain wall? So then you need to finish, is it an exposed?
I don't know.
Okay. I'm just thinking like extra cost.
He sent me a detailed drawing, and I was like, I can't read this.
Okay.
I'm a dumb developer. I'm not an engineer, so.
Is that text right there?
What?
Is that text right there?
Yeah, it is.
If I may quickly add to the windows and insulation discussion, when you go from double to triple pane, you will save a lot of operational energy, but you're increasing the embodied energy. Insulation is the same, you're increasing the insulation, you'll save operational, but the embodied energy goes up. So every time you do that, there is growing awareness that that's the case, and I've seen projects where triple glazing windows were abandoned because of that reason. They were not saving as much as they were upfront penalty.
And then on the insulation piece, like mineral wool has a lot of other benefits outside of the black carbon. It's a naturally fire retardant material.
Yeah.
It's stable if it gets wet. It's just required after a certain point, like 6 floors up, if you have metal panels.
And you just have to plan for a little bit extra thickness for a given R value. That's all.
Resistant, but
Yeah.
they have a lot.
So that was it. And then in the report, there's kind of even more kind of detail on recommendations for you guys to kind of have a conversation, so.
Okay. I guess any more questions before we move on?
I have a really specific one. Did you look at the carbon cure with the concrete?
I did. I dabbled a little bit into that, but it was really hard to find really good research on that. But if you have like,
I think carbon cure is the brand specific version. of it.
yes, yeah.
Sequestering carbon.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
sequestering is what you're talking about, yeah.
Carbon cure is it's sort of sequestering carbon. It is, but what they do is they will store gas.
They inject it with
at
the,
plant.
yeah.
They have a magic box. Essentially, it's liquid in the mixer as the concrete batches. There are some limitations with it because what it does, and this isn't a slam on carbon cure, we have it on a couple of plants out west. What it does is essentially reforms calcium carbonate. So there's a limit. The last time I looked at their website, you get about 25, 30 pounds of cement savings in a cubic yard, which is, you can do a little bit more than that just plain with the recipe. But it's good. It's limited in availability, but it certainly doesn't preclude anything else that's being done either within a mix or otherwise. The other thing that I would think about when looking at sequestering CO2 in concrete, it's limited obviously to what's exposed to the atmosphere. There is a little bit of a limit on how much you can account for looking ahead. calculator on trying to figure that out, but it's a guess at the moment. It's possible, but there are limitations, kind of what makes it where it is, and things like that.
Is there a price premium?
That just exists. There's nothing that you can really do, well, sort of. You won't have it, for example, on a floor or pavement, which are denser mixes. You might have it on a sidewalk or curb, which you can afford extra void space and room for that mineral to reform.
I think they have an EPD now.
Was that?
I think they have an EPD now.
Who?
Carbon Cure.
I'm sure they do.
Yeah.
But it will vary plant to plant,
Yeah.
region to region. And one of the things with your carbon using blended cements actually impacts its performance a little bit.
So from your perspective, because you're supplying the concrete, right? So do you feel like I'm curious as an architecture firm, you all said performance specs, maybe you have a performance spec for it, but where do you feel like you should come into the process in order for us to truly get on site what we need to get in order to make this all happen? Like, is it that you really need to be interfacing with the contractor as they're pulling in the bids, or is it at the
Architects, engineers, developers.
get all those things in the specs, in the architectural specs, and then move on from there?
Update the LCA with the site information given by the contractor.
Okay.
Well, you are.
Yeah.
I know you guys.
But if let's say a specialist in your firm is doing the LCA,
Yeah.
you have to build that into your scope. Otherwise, it'll be
Well,
an
we
extra
started
task.
tracking, I mean, we have analysis on, we're part of the 2030, AIA challenge, so we've started tracking everything.
Right.
I think that getting you in and explaining to the architects who are specifying, writing the architectural specs, and just them understanding in depth, and some of them I'm sure do. And we do have a specialist that really works with the teams, but I was trying to understand how we can help move the needle.
Us being talking to you guys at design, the group I'm in with the CEMEX USA is fairly small, and that's primarily our job. Is conversations like this, conversations with designers, and Charles mentioned he and I go back a little ways, but that's where we are. The thing that will also help you is American Concrete Institute is they've already published for public comment, which is very quick with them. A new code is set to be published later this year, and if it actually happens later this year, it'd be awesome. And the idea is to set GWP targets based on regional benchmarks that the NRMCA sort of has and are revisiting. There are some debatable points about some of the NRMCA targets. They're not bad. They're re-looking at them because they are regional, as we commented earlier.
The regional targets are tougher than the national.
What was that?
The regional ones tend to be tougher.
The regional benchmarks are based on what's actually capable of being done.
Right.
The national just is what it is.
Right.
It really doesn't hold any water except it's something to think about.
Right.
So the regional one for the Southeast is based on Frankenstein's monster of concrete mixes that will never be delivered to any project ever. So NRMCA is looking at that again based on stuff that's actually really done within various markets. Because you're not going to put slag and fly ash in most mixes in Atlanta because slag's not available or as readily.
Yeah.
So there's that, and they're going to start to set those regional benchmarks, or using those to set some GWP targets. But back to your first point, I'm kind of moving ahead. First and foremost, it's performance-based. Because no matter what we do to reduce carbon, if it falls, then we're wasting our time. So there's that, and that's coming and will help you. And I'm more than happy to help with those conversations. But the quicker we get in those discussions, the more we can help you.
Typically, add to that, setting a target and not enforcing it is much better than not setting a target. You'll have some conversations on what can be done, can't be done.
Well, and the good news is you're as designed versus as built. If the targets are based on regional benchmarks, which is great. You look at the regional benchmarks, you look at the volumes, just like you said before, you get an overall number. Then you'll get as-built, because you'll get plant-specific EPDs for the concrete mixes. And it'll be a little bit under, a little bit over this and that, but when the bottom number is reduced, that's kind of the direction we're looking to go.
Is it us or more the structural engineer with mixed design?
Say again?
Is it us or the structural engineers with mixed design?
Both. The real thing is try not to be, I hate to use the word afraid, but let's just go with it, of percentages of ash or things of that nature. We have conversations. I talked to a developer about a month ago. Why do you limit your fly ash? Because that's what they were doing when I got here. So there's a little bit of an evolution.
They got put once 25 years ago.
That's probably a reasonable guess as to what happened.
And then how much do you engage like actual subcontractors? Like our construction side tends to partner with like Donley's a lot because they have pre-made efficient structural formwork, so it's not a bunch of carpenters. And they reuse those job to job to job to job to job, which we don't necessarily look at that because obviously it's incredibly difficult to track. But how much are you engaging the subcontractors on that? Because they'll buy 5,000 PSI concrete times 1,000, even though they need 2,500. It's just easier to get, you know.
Well, we engage as a company, obviously, with contractors. But part of my role is also to engage with some of our internal groups and help them have some of those conversations. Because contractors, and we all know what press releases say. And then when it gets down to the guy on the job, can you get it to me Tuesday? And if the answer is no, he calls the next time. Right. And so the earlier we have those conversations, probably as an entire development team, both designers, contractors, and I think you mentioned even getting the whole group together early, you can start planning ahead. That doesn't directly answer your question, but we do, when a contractor called me the other day, what's this going to do to me when I pour it? And considering what he was doing, nothing. He already knew how to use it, but there will be some education. They can let it cement so they come into the market more often.
I might give a quick plug. Les does great lunch and learns presentations. And I'm trying to remember the project we last worked on, but it's going to come to me probably after I leave here today.
Now that you mention
That's a
that,
good thing for us to, that's something LBI can do, to have lunch and learns and things like that, to make sure that we're taking this knowledge we're gaining today and getting it to everyone else as well.
I'm happy to do that. We'll talk, and I can set up a variety of topics on the carbon and anything related to it.
So the policy part is why we're all really here today, so.
So the presentation until now was free?
Okay, so I'm going to talk, part of our task, we talked about, what does it look like to implement we called it an embodied carbon plan, and we also referenced like a voluntary LCA program, and really when that leads into policy. So what I'm going to be talking about is really just a high-level review of policy and just my kind of riffs on recommendations. There's more detail in our report, and I think hopefully everything you've gotten so far is good tee-ups to help you digest this stuff pretty fast. There's two main types of embodied carbon policies. Like they fall into two categories. There's prescriptive and based and performance based. And this will probably, if you knew nothing about embodied carbon, which I know all of you knew plenty when you showed up, some of this should kind of fall in line with what we said earlier today. So the prescriptive based policies are essentially just setting that GWP, Wes mentioned the acronym earlier, but the global warming potential, like a cap or a reduction on a particular product. And those are typically aimed at structure. And then when I say typically, I'm talking about policies that are already in place, whether they're voluntary or mandatory. They're typically aimed at structure. They're honestly typically just aimed at concrete. Most of those prescriptive policies are aimed at concrete. They're much easier to enforce. It doesn't take a lot of training to know that one number is less than another number. It doesn't take a whole lot of kind of technical skill. So if you're dealing with a plan reviewer or maybe even somebody in the field, it's easier to kind of enforce and follow along with. As we kind of referenced a number of times, it doesn't always result in a net positive benefit. You could, Ramana mentioned the triple versus double pane glass. If you just by, and maybe that's that's the inverse of that, by increasing your embodied carbon, you're reducing operational. Well, if you go from triple to double, you've reduced your embodied carbon, but you may be increasing operational, and you're really not providing any sort of net benefit. So it's a little, it's maybe a little bit clumsier than a performance-based program, which would typically be an LCA-based program or policy. And Claire did a great job of kind of running through why those are great. They're, all the lines there just start with more. They're more flexible to market changes, which is really probably the most important part of them. If things change and steel goes through the roof, you can still meet that target. You just have a lot more flexibility to meet the targets. They're also a lot more accurate. They're also more costly to perform. It takes money to do an LCA. It's like getting a LEED certification. It's not free. It's not that much money, but it does cost money. And it takes a lot of expertise. You've got to, which is part of why it takes money. You have to find those experts, pay them, and more expertise on the enforcement side.
So the typical, cost for the LCA of the overall project, is it like a percentage cost?
I don't know.
It depends on the boundaries you set.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Like 50K, 25K? What's a ballpark?
Again, I can't. It's hard because you're doing design assistance, and then as design at the end of design, and as built at the end of construction. So it really depends on what all you want. Because I'm on tape, I can't commit to them.
This is just kind of a high-level survey of, I meant to back up. There's a third sort of category, and Shauna dove into this earlier. I didn't put it up here because we're not talking about it a lot, but the third category is exemption, which is usually based in building reuse. And I'll talk a little bit about CalGreen. Like, they basically have 3 buckets. An exemption, getting exempt is one of the things. It's essentially, most of those are through, if you reuse a building, that's enough. So these are just some of the more well-known prescriptive embodied carbon policies out there. Denver has one that's focused on steel and concrete. Marin County, which is that's like where the rich people live in San Francisco. That is one of the first ones of these that was implemented, and that's a strictly carbon. Portland has a low carbon concrete policy and program. And then one of the most referenced and kind of robust programs is CalGreen's, which I think went into effect. CalGreen is California's green building code, and that went into effect. The Embodied Carbon program, I think it was late 22, and they have a kind of prescriptive path and a performance-based path and that exemption. There also are typically, I'll mention, there are thresholds for these. For example, the CalGreen one doesn't apply to like a single-family home. I think under CalGreen, it's commercial buildings over 100,000 square feet, and they also have a lower threshold. It's schools over 50,000 square feet. And then just kind of a survey of performance embodied carbon policies and programs. CalGreen has that performance option. And just to kind of give you like a high-level overview, CalGreen's performance-based target or requirement is 10% reduction over baseline of embodied carbon. Ramona went through the LEED, kind of the way that the LEED credit works, the Building Lifestyle Impact Reduction Credit, and kind of having different tiers. There's also, which I thought was interesting, and I found this a couple of times in research, the city of Austin has essentially a voluntary LCA program that gets a lot of traction, and we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But basically, Austin's program, you know, they just kind of promote, there's a lot of kind of, they do a lot to promote those projects that do participate, so there's kind of like a PR incentive for it. What's that?
You get better rents too.
Better rents?
Our Austin office, we report our projects like that.
For office?
Yeah, we've been tracking the rent rate. They actually get probably $3 more a foot than leases.
Yeah. Okay, so this is, my bolding isn't coming in through as well as I wanted on this. But this is some of our just high-level recommendations. And I was talking with an expert at Kinley Horn, and he kept saying this over and over again, like, it really just starts with reporting. The more that you report this stuff, the more that we can do. That's kind of how EPDs start. You know, we really just needed to start, and we're still filling in all the gaps. We really just need to start by picking all the EPDs. So just by encouraging people to report.
Even the CLF database, the more you populate it, the more useful.
Right, right. So just encouraging projects to report however you can is really the first step. I kind of have a high-level phase overview, which is just my own personal kind of riff on what a rollout might look like, and just having surveyed a lot of different policies around the country, but making it, you know, a phased approach. We mentioned a couple of times recommending a performance-based approach, which kind of provides a lot of flexibility, and it allows the policy to be resilient against changes. And then Ramona kind of alluded to earlier, if you use something that also meets another standard, in this case LEED, then, you know, there's synergies and more incentive to play along with it. I think under in Ramona's estimation, a majority of projects just now that are meeting some sort of LEED certification are at least doing an LCA. So if you get one, you get the other.
Just to quickly add to the menu, ILFI runs several certifications, Living Building Challenge, Core, and whatnot. So Living Building Challenge version 3, you didn't have to, you just had to do an LCA, and whatever carbon footprint was residual, you had to offset it. You didn't have to show that you were reducing by a certain percentage. But version 4 now requires 20% reduction. So you can't offset before you reduce by 20%.
So this is just kind of this is like a 3 to 4 phase sort of rollout. And I'll just, like I mentioned, there's no, other than CalGreen, which does have multiple categories, there's not really a robust program out there that has a required LCA, or a policy out there that has a required LCA program. And there's a lot of, we've talked about a lot of the reasons for that. But since we're focused on the performance and LCA side of things, the kind of first phase might be, I'll just use words like might or could when I talk through this, but the first phase might be having a voluntary program that, you know, meets the LEED standards. If you're producing an LCA that meets the standard under LEED for that at 1 point, you're in the program. And this is similar to the way Austin's voluntary energy, Austin Energy, their green building program works with respect to embodied carbon. They have a bunch of other stuff as well. They have a lot of good resources. And then the second phase might move into a voluntary program with incentives built in if you are high performing. So we, you know, it's it's voluntary to participate, and if you do participate and you're over a certain threshold, a certain reduction, then let's say it's 10%, we kind of targeted like 11% for like a good building. If you're over 10%, you might get some sort of benefit for that back to the developer. That might be density, it might be, and I'm a civil engineer, so I think a lot about this kind of zoning and entitlement related things. This could be a number, but it might be density or open space, or being able to do something else that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And then that kind of, the second part of that second phase would be hopefully moving into a required LCA with incentives for the highest performing. So there's just some sort, you have to, and when I say required, you're required to do it, and you're required to meet, I'm sorry, that's the next phase. Everybody's required to do it, and then you get the incentives for higher performance buildings. You might move the threshold of the needle up a little bit in that phase. And then the fourth phase would be everybody's required to meet some base level of embodied carbon reduction, and there's an incentive for those highest performing buildings moving into that best category. If you can hit that best category, then you can still keep those incentives. So that was just me sitting up late at night. That was my idea of like how this might roll out over a period of the next 5 to 10 plus years.
What do you guys, does it match anything? Sorry.
I have a question, because I just remember from last year there was a conversation that like Livable Buckhead, you can't really create a policy like this, right?
Yeah, we can.
You can, okay.
We have to go through the city's process.
Right, through the city. So that's where I guess I was going with all this.
Yep.
Like, a lot of the, or all the examples you gave, or a county, or a city, or we're talking about a district within a
So we
city.
can drive it.
Yeah.
So, and this is how we do for these districts already, with the creation of the SBIs, that
Yeah.
actually was a local community-driven effort. And then we get that legislated through the city of Atlanta. So we would propose changes, text amendments, map amendments to the SBI districts, and then we would work that through the appropriate channels to get it codified.
So because I know there are a couple SBIs that are right around here. So do you see that as the path?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And you
Yeah,
guys
this
take
is
on
similar to the Better Buildings Challenge, with the whole energy side. It's
Yep.
the same kind of approach. They started with the voluntary program that was just a challenge and lots of hype and lots of, ooh, you get prizes and recognition. That came down from the federal level, so that was a lot helpful for us. But going from that voluntary, then they started the reporting requirements, and then moving into the next phases would be more reductions and things like that, requirements. I'm curious about I was always kind of thinking a materials list, a red list, or something like that. What are your thoughts on that? Because it seems like there's some that we know we don't want.
The red list exists.
What was that?
The red list exists. It's part of the EPDs. There's a red list of materials that
Yeah.
generally should be avoided. Challenges like living building don't allow you to have any red list.
But should we use something like that locally and incorporate that into our zoning ordinance? Or is it known enough that you guys stay away from it?
It's a challenge.
It's not.
I would be scared to do that because, well, one, things could change and you have to keep it
Yeah.
updated. And then there's always, nobody's better at finding, sorry to the developers in the room, but developers are always really good at finding loopholes. Everybody is. We all get paid to find loopholes. And, I think about like the eliminating EAFs. And I know that a lot of people have success doing that, but some people are just calling it a different thing. You change one little thing and, well, it's not EAFs anymore, but it still walks and talks and smells like EAFs. So.
Is there a standard we can tie to?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know. I don't know. I'm happy to look into that more.
So, red list is health related, right? That's a slightly different track than the scope we had in mind. What I would say is if y'all are looking to expand the program, for example, apparently on the worst projects, the construction related carbon activity is like 30% of the overall embodied carbon. Usually it's like 7, 15, 20, but it can balloon to 30%. So maybe as you expand stuff, you want to look at that A1, A2, A3, and that stages of life cycle, and fold in the construction activity after just about.
So you have to report through B5 as a company because of a very specific client.
Okay.
AT&T.
Okay.
And like we're 900 people across 7 cities. We do about 1.2 billion in design and construction, and we're about 60,000 tons. In terms, so like a building is 300-ish. A truck is like 4.
Right.
And that's everything. That's our on-site footprint. That's literally my commute to my office and back. What kind of car I'm driving.
Right. Scope 3.
Stuff. So and we're small.
Right.
So there's a huge missing piece.
Yeah.
Beyond that A3 portion.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can fold in the local contractors and get them to report stuff, maybe.
Can't be done. It's a pain.
But the red list idea is a good one. Absolutely, no doubt about it.
So what are y'all thinking in terms of what that structure should look like? And
The question is the involvement of the SBI is early enough to be in the.
yeah, it's not.
That's the thing. So.
We need
the
enough
SBI is
triggers
so
in the
late.
SBI that force the early involvement. So could we do something like require a project team to have, I mean, obviously requiring an LCA would be the key thing that would make all that happen, but is there some way we can influence the teams to where you are doing that collaboration on the front end? I mean, y'all are you come through the DRC process and stuff, so curious how we would do that to influence, because
Maybe
our.
you guys have a good relationship with the NPU, like,
Oh, yeah.
they're at the front, they're at the very, very front, you know what I mean? So like, I would say, working with them and at least that being part of the conversation for those required community engagements, is maybe a good way to start, because that's already, that process is already built in, you might as well plug into it, that already exists.
That's at the end there too.
If you phase.
The NPU, when they're getting zoning, the end of design.
You've got a lot of the scope done. We see things at the same time the NPU does.
Usually developers are going in when they're at the concept phase to get zoning, I would say.
Or,
Like,
but
they don't
I will
have
say
fully
for,
baked, they don't have like fully baked design.
yeah. But for, I will say for like, for Buckhead, Midtown, like SPI, 1, 9, 12, 16, you're going in usually after SD.
Okay.
Because the code is so form-based and has all this stuff, you can't go in with bubbles, you know, you gotta have stuff nailed down.
So it's not just the concept, site plan that's added.
No, like if you were doing a rezoning and then did the SAP, you were rezoning.
There are a lot of things that happen during design development. I mean, I know there are things that would be great at day one, right? The massing, how many floors, all these things that start to influence, especially when you're talking about structure. But when we're talking about concrete mix and
Yeah,
things,
that's
those are
happening
happening after
Yeah.
you guys see everyone. So I mean, getting very early beginning, I don't know, but you are seeing things early enough to influence change, even if you see them at the end of SD, I think.
No, I totally
Maybe
agree.
not everything, but you know, we're talking about exposure and trying to move the needle.
If we divide the process into 3 or 4 different segments, which every process needs to get some sort of an approval or a signature or
So
something.
that's done by the city. So
Yeah.
that we are part of that process that they dictate that. So that's where we don't influence buildings, that we see a lot of the more detail on that end. So it's how do we're the zoning code kind of piece on the very front end that starts the rest of it. So we actually are working through, we're gonna start tracking projects more along the way. So this might be a time for us to say, okay, when you get to certain pieces where you have to report in Excel, you know, that we need to see it back. At that point, we have to look further down the process than where we're usually in, I think, is what we're kind of figuring out of this.
I
think
keep
one
going back to the TMP. So I mean, the TMP is sort of just, I mean,
Yeah.
it's the closest thing that I have. It's not a perfect example, but like, you know, when you go to, and I haven't done anything in Buckhead soon, but I have one that might come soon. We haven't done anything in Buckhead recently, but like when I've gone to Midtown recently, you submit, and it's like the first dang thing Carl Smith Davis tells you is you gotta submit TMP, you know? We're like, wait a minute, that's not, we don't do that until the end of the project. And they're like, no, give it to us now, give us a draft, you know? Now obviously a TMP is easier than an LCA, but I would see it kind of maybe being the same. As soon as you hear about it, okay, we have this requirement, and it could be like a TMP, like a prerequisite for a CO. Which is what, the city doesn't always do the best job of enforcing that.
Yeah, it's in the code now for all of us, but it's similar. Because it's the timing of when those different pieces, those decisions are made.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Yeah.
And a big part of it is not just purely on the enforcement, but rather on the educational part. Just like how you said, when you have a structural engineer, is paired up with the architect from the early on, the ROI on it can be $750,000. So I think that's it's tough to enforce it, but if there is an educational part about it, with pure examples, that's.
So where are your professional associations? Where are they on this? Because you don't look to us for this stuff. It should be your professional associations that are doing that. Where is that not happening?
Well, I mentioned earlier, and we put it in the action plan last year, there are commitments from, where you take TDS, and I think HKS is signed
Yeah,
up,
you've got
the AA 2030, but not
There is an SC 2050 also.
and structural and mechanical.
But what's being done to support you getting there? Where's that education coming? Is it ULI? Is it, where's it?
Education happening at the local level.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Like we do it, a lot of it's grassroots within the firms. I think, and, not every firm has their own way of doing things, and often everyone's not going to sign up to hire HKS or TBS.
Right.
I mean, I know we do a lot of work, both firms do a lot of work with Cousins, but depending on the scale of the developer, they may not, their architects and structural engineers, and Kimley Horn, right, they may not hire on firms that really take that priority.
We do see that higher level firm just because of where we are around costs, but how do, I guess we should start then maybe partnering with ULI and trying to do more on that local education to get these front-end things happening more.
I think the more people ask for it too, right? Like if the firms are starting to push their professional associations, like, hey, we want this information, we need information. I think we just asking a lot for it, and that will help push everybody forward.
To add to that, an LCA process is garbage in, garbage out. And there's a lot of leadership who's brought on to the idea of reducing embodied carbon and all that. But reliable people who can actually do LCA models, there's a dearth of those people. So I don't know how we go about fixing that. But
So that's a good step for us, though, in your 4-step process there. I think we still have, and this goes back to the original carbon ECAP that we did, that education component was number 1. So we still have a lot of work to do on the whole front, of getting all of this in place. So I think we definitely, that's something, Helen, for us to really focus on, because a lot of the architecture lines are right here up in Buckhead. So if we can start kind of getting them all together, because even just this education, this conversation was really helpful, I think, across the board for everybody. So if we're doing more of that, then that sounds like it's actually beneficial. We got to get to the experts on this real fast, or find the right experts to bring in. But any other thoughts on the process moving forward? Questions?
I want to ask you guys, did it meet your overall expectations? Did it go far enough in your?
We would have liked to have a real building, but
Right.
what we got.
Right. Yeah. I agree.
Well, I think one of the things we do want to do with this is that we were trying to get a baseline across the whole community. So can we do that now with the data that you got together, even just with the, like here's the general size of the building, type of construction? Can we get to a sort of aggregate baseline of where we are as a community with our existing stuff?
The only problem is there's not a standard that defines what the baseline should be. So it's extremely
I've seen in other
local.
cities, like in Boston, I think it was Boston, they're doing the voluntary LCA program to create the baseline.
Yeah.
So they're not wanting to come up with a number themselves, they're wanting to try to get the buy-in from the community first.
I think it almost has to happen that way too, where you've given an example, right? And you get the voluntary program going, and then you start to use that data to build your baseline, I think would be a good approach. I mean, that would make sense.
I'm a little
That would
worried
again
that we
depend
won't
on
get the
new
representation,
construction.
right?
Yeah, like how much new
That would
construction is
depend
gonna-
on
gate point
how
for you.
fast you're gonna get new construction.
Yeah, I don't know.
So just for y'all, it's
Yeah.
kind of like
And then-
back of the curtain, behind the curtain stuff. We went to 4 different companies to try to get them to release their models for us to use as the model for this, and nobody will do it.
Oh.
They're all worried about their data being out there, so I'm kind of worried that we won't get participation in a voluntary.
Yeah, I don't know, timeline, I'd love to hear from the other kind of architects and designers in the room, but there are some really interesting conversations right now happening in the industry around the digital twin and sharing data, and I think we're right at the cusp of even understanding how we can all share our models and data outside of our
It's a
teams.
very tricky conversation.
Yeah, you're the expert.
Everybody.
You know, we are there at extracting data from our BIM and having it at our disposal. I have not been in conversations with other architecture firms talking about exchanging data.
Yeah.
But I do know of the Construction Industry Institute that actually got a lot of data for construction from multiple architecture and construction firms for hospitals, for healthcare. So there are other organizations that may be able to pull that. And yeah, I would take this up at the FRG for CIOs to be able to figure out how is it going to end up in, because that's our secret sauce, right? And
Yeah.
Well, I think
but if you think of embodied carbon, I think construction data might be a little more important to tackle.
But for those who had the bins before and didn't want to share it, it was mainly on the copyright and exposure, right? Now, if you reverse this ideology and celebrate whoever had, not shared the bins, but per se is following the LCAs and following what we're talking about. If we have even one and you blow it out within the community, people, I think, from knowledge stand and they want to be the next me. I think.
But I think if we figure out what are those aspects that are important in an LCA that would be the exact things that we provide to the architects, designers, structural
Without the whole
engineers.
thing, but like.
Yeah, it's just like, we don't want everything. We just want you to work on this one platform where you submit your
It's gonna be
numbers. That's it.
It takes one to really get the buy-in, and that becomes part of the branding within the community and
Yeah.
to drive it. Just like Coca-Cola with the recycling, just like Google, and they have it at the bottom. Of the
Yeah,
website.
carbon neutral since 2007.
Yeah.
Exactly, there you go.
So you mentioned your partnership or relationship with ULI, and I'm just thinking out loud here, but just the awards and the prestige that come with, like we attend the ULI Awards banquet every year, and there is a lot of prestige with winning one of those awards. So maybe you can partner with ULI to introduce a new award that's part of their program, because, and I hope Daphne and others still get here, but I don't know if that's possible, but a lot of firms strive to meet that level, and there's a ton of exposure in the room. So like, I don't know.
Well, and at a
James,
national
here's
level
the-
too.
Yeah.
Well, globally, right, ULI has their global initiative towards
Yeah.
net zero and carbon neutrality. So, it might even be, you start at that level of the organization and be like, hey, why don't they create an award that they can push down to the districts as well, right? Have that conversation up there.
The James Beard Award for Construction.
It's tasty. Awesome. Anything
really appreciate the
Well,
opportunity.
thank you
Yeah,
guys,
thanks for-
appreciate the work
Thank
for
you.
us. And very excited, and thank you all for coming out today. I think we need to do kind of another one of these with a lot of the architecture firms and structural engineers and kind of really target those groups getting together. I think that would probably be a really great next step.
So on behalf of ULI, I know Barbara's not here, but I just want to say thank you to Livable Buckhead. I know, you guys are a great client for mTAP. So Patricia, who just left, is the chair for next year. So I will give you her contact information to reach out, and I'm sure she'll send you stuff for next year if you guys are already thinking about that. And team, I think you did a great job kind of adding to the body of work that was done before, and just really good concrete stuff to think about. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.